That here was constructed in 1916 by the American Bridge Company and was used by the Central of Georgia Railroad in Macon, Georgia. This table is 80 feet long and it weighs in at 80 tons. Keep in mind the average school bus only weighs in at 6 or 7 tons. That locomotive there weighs in at a total of 215 tons, so when it is on the table, the overall weight between the two is going to be sitting just under 300 tons. So it may surprise you to know that this table was originally turned by hand. It was an Armstrong table. There would have been poles extending out the ends of the table, and it would have taken 4 people to push those poles to spin the table around. Do we have any volunteers? We're going to need 4. We got 2, 3, and 4. Come on over. No, I'm just kidding. We don't do it that way anymore. Now today we just use a small 25 horsepower motor under the operator shed here that our flagman Andrew will be operating. Now our locomotive today is the Southern Railway 4501, built in 1911 by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was built for the Southern Railway as a mainline freight locomotive. Now the Southern Railway retired in 1948. At that time, it was sold to the Kentucky and Tennessee Railway in Stearns, Kentucky, where it was used to haul coal down from the mines. It was again retired by that railroad and then sold to one of our co-founders here at the museum, Paul Merriman, for $5,000 in his own cash. And then in the early 1960s, he brought it to Chattanooga under its own power. And the locomotive has been here, operating on and off on the museum site and on mainline excursions ever since. Now this locomotive is a 282 Mikado. And what that means is it has 2 small driving wheels, or 2 small pilot wheels in the front, 8 large drive wheels in the middle, and a set of 2 trailing wheels under the cab and firebox. This first 282 ever purchased by the Southern Railway, hundreds they would eventually purchase, and ironically enough, it is the only Southern Railway 282 that survives today. This locomotive operates at 205 psi. It has 63-inch diameter driving wheels and produces 53,900 pounds of active effort. Now, as you can see, the wheelbase of this locomotive does fit on the turntable, but the locomotive itself is longer than the turntable, extending off both ends by just a few feet. So if you're at that yellow line, I do need you to take an extra step or 2 back so the front coupler does not come and give you a slap on the way around. Now, if you look up at the cab there, you'll see our engineer, Brian. He's responsible for operating this locomotive and getting us here safely today. So everyone go ahead and give him a wave. Hey, Brian. Just another minute or 2 before he gets turning. The toggle switches in the cabinet, and somebody wants the cabinet, so somebody's got to run over to the shop and get the key. So until then, I'll go ahead and tell you how this locomotive operates. So the way this locomotive works is up in the cab there, our fireman Joseph is feeding coal into the firebox where it is burning, about 3 to 6 tons of it a day. Now on the front side of this firebox, there is a series of tubes that run the entire length of the boiler. Those are called the flues. The hot gases from this fire will travel through those flues and then up and out that stack. Now surrounding the flues in the firebox is water. That was loud. Now the water is heated by those hot gases and converts, of course, to steam. And steam does expand. It raises the boiler pressure, in this case, up to 205 psi. When Brian opens that throttle, that steam is channeled down into these large cylinders you see on the front of the locomotive. Inside this cylinder is a large piston the steam is pushing on either side of. And this piston is in turn connected to these rods, and the rods, of course, are connected to the driving wheels. So as the piston is being moved in and out, it is rotating these rods, therefore turning the driving wheels and propelling the locomotive. Now, after that steam has been exhausted from the cylinders, it mixes with the hot gases in the smoke box at the front of the locomotive, the gray portion at the front of the boiler, and then shoots up and out the stack. Now, that exhausting steam actually creates a vacuum inside that motor box, and that vacuum in turn is what actually creates the chuffing sound you hear when you see a steam locomotive. Now, as the hot gases and steam are escaping out the stack, that actually, when it creates that vacuum, it causes a draft to pull through the bed of the fire in the firebox, and it actually makes it burn hotter. So the faster this locomotive goes, the hotter the fire gets actually, and the more steam it produces. So the faster it goes, the more power it has. Now earlier when I said this locomotive is a 282 Mikado, what that means, of course, I mentioned earlier, the two pilot wheels, 8 driving wheels, 2 trailing wheels. Well, the term Mikado is actually a Japanese word meaning emperor, and the reason these were called Mikados is because the first ever locomotive built with this wheel arrangement was sold to one of the state railways in Japan. Now, this locomotive is commonly credited with being the steam locomotive that started the steam preservation movement. Had this locomotive not been saved, there would not have been the drive at that point to start saving other locomotives and really started that movement. So had this one not been saved, many of the others that we still have around with us today would not exist. We're cleaning the water out of the air reservoir there. Everyone, this is our fireman Joseph. He's responsible for feeding that fire and as well as maintaining the water level in the boiler, and in turn creating all the steam this engine operates on. Without him, this locomotive would not be going anywhere, so we want to give him a wave as well. A round of applause, either way. Now, most of you have probably seen this locomotive before and don't even realize it. This locomotive has been used in many Hollywood films and music videos. For example, it's been used in many of Johnny Cash's music videos that involve railroading. It was also in a documentary featuring Johnny Cash that he did. It was called Riding the Rails. In the intro to that documentary, he was actually at the throttle of this locomotive running it for the intro. And that was not fake. He actually ran this locomotive himself. Of course, it's been used in many films and television shows as well. For example, I believe one of the first was called Full Trade, starring, it was either James Stewart or Jimmy Stewart. I can't ever get that right. It's one of the two. The most famous film it was in was a 1999 film many of you have probably seen called October Sky, starring Jake Gyllenhaal. For those of you that have seen that film, you may recall a scene in which the kids are going to rip up some track to get some scrap out of it, the scrap money to fund their rocket project. And then a train comes along and they begin to panic. Well, the locomotive you see in that scene was the 4501 here. It's repainted for the film as a Norfolk and Western engine instead of a Southern locomotive. Of course, as the locomotive comes around, you'll be able to see a plaque here on the side of the pilot, right where I'm pointing at here. This plaque is actually the plaque stating that this locomotive is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Even though we don't try to turn this table by hand nowadays, there are times where this table does not like to operate for mechanical issues, and we do actually have to get out and push it by hand. In fact, we had to do that just 2 weekends ago. Now, to line the table up with the correct track today, we still use the original method, and that would be the antique method of eyesight. Of course, these turntables back in the day were not always used to be in the line like this. Most commonly, they would be in front of what was called a roundhouse. A building built around the turntable, and it would have a stall where the locomotives could go in and receive maintenance. As you can see, our locomotive is, our train is currently sitting on track 1, and we've on the locomotive up on track 2. That is so what we can do what is called a runaround. We're going to run the locomotive past the train beyond the switch. That switch will then be thrown, and the locomotive will then reverse into the train so it can pull us back in the opposite direction. Now that we've completed turning the locomotive around, we can go ahead and start making our way back to the train for the return to the transaction. Please remember just to return at the same seat and car you rode in on the way over. Don't forget there are restrooms available in the depot. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to come and ask me those questions. I do love questions, so please don't hesitate to ask.